Okay, Marsha Rosenberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For people who aren't familiar with you, perhaps if you can just give a quick bit of background on yourself and what brought you to Japan.
Sure. I'm a certified speech and language pathologist that I received my training in the United States and continue to be certified by the U.S. American Association of Speech and Language Pathologists. So that means that I have to do continuing education ongoing all the time in order to keep that certification. But
Yeah.
I have been in Japan for a very long time. I originally came with my husband in 1972, which was a
Wow.
very long time ago.
Didn't actually realize it was that long. Wow.
That was our first time here. And we had just graduated from Ohio State University, and my husband was a Japanese history major, and we had an
Okay.
opportunity to teach English, to come to Japan to teach English, and he wanted to study Japanese. So we came, and for a year, our plan was to come for 1 year,
Mm.
but we really loved Japan, and we ended up staying at that time for 3 years. And finally I said, listen, I have to go back. I have to get my master's degree. I want to be
Mm.
able to do something in my field. So we went back to Cleveland, Ohio, where we're from. I got my master's degree. I worked in the public schools there for a few years, and one day my husband came home and said, oh, I really think we should go back to Japan. And that was in the early 80s, when the bubble time in Japan, when they, lots of businesses were starting up, and there were a lot of foreign companies coming to Japan, and he spoke Japanese fluently, could read Japanese. So he was hired by a company to come back to Japan. And in 1982, we came back with two little girls. We had two children then, and we've remained here ever since. And I actually did not think I was going to be able to do speech and language work in Japan. I mean, I really didn't have any idea, because I had been an English teacher before and didn't really know the expat community at that time.
Mm.
But I started getting, I met someone who said, oh, they need a speech and language pathologist at ASIJ's nursery kindergarten. And then things just started to explode with numbers of clients, because there were very few speech and language pathologists who could work in the English speaking community.
Yeah.
So I began doing some private work and working at both Nishimachi and ASIJ. And I actually worked for ASIJ for like 35 years until I retired, and
Yeah.
had a private practice as well. And I became interested, I don't know, in currently I have retired from ASIJ, and I have a private practice, and I also am the referral source for a group of English speaking speech and language pathologists who take referrals from the community.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. So I guess just talking about that for a little bit, how many therapists do you have, and do you each have specialities within the field of speech pathology, or how does that work?
It's a good question. Well, that number fluctuates, because that
Mm.
just depends. Most of the speech pathologists here are here with their spouse, and they're just working part-time because they happen to be here. There are a few that are
Mm.
here permanently, and there are a few that work solely for an international school. They're hired by that international school. I would say
Sure.
we have about 12 in our group.
Wow. Yeah.
At a time, it's usually around 10 to 12. And yes, they do have specialities. We have a few therapists who really have had good, extensive experience working with adults, and most work with children, but there are often adults in the English speaking community that need services. And
Yeah.
luckily, we have some of the therapists who are very qualified in working with people who've had strokes, or
Yeah.
people who have voice disorders, or whatever, maybe for an adult.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. We were talking a little bit about this off air, but how has this whole current situation affected your practice? I'm assuming you're doing most of the consultations remotely now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Almost all of the speech pathologists in our group are doing our work remotely. And in actuality, teletherapy has been going on in speech and language pathology for probably 25 or 30 years. It's not
Yeah.
new.
Yeah.
And it's probably in Australia where there are remote places that are remote, in the US where there are places remote that don't have services.
Mm.
They're out, they're not able to access speech and language services, so the therapists, do teletherapy. And it actually is quite successful. I mean, there's a lot of um, practice, pedagogy on how to do teletherapy. What is it, what is ethical, what is acceptable, what is not. We actually have a lot of rules about it
Right.
within our organization. So
Mm.
it's worked out fine, actually. No,
Yeah.
no problem.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And within speech pathology, there's a lot of different areas that we could discuss. But today, what we wanted to get you on and discuss was raising bilingual children, which I think is relevant to a certain number of families out here, in particular those who are here more for the long term. Um, you're sort of considered a bit of an expert in this field, and I believe that your children and your grandchildren are bilingual. Is that correct?
That is correct. When actually, that was a major goal of ours when we returned to Japan in the early 80s. Um, many people want their children to be basketball players or politicians or, skiers. But my husband wanted fluent Japanese speakers
Yeah.
because he had studied Japanese, as an adult, and he really wanted our kids to be able to be fluent in Japanese. So we actually came without having much knowledge about bilingual. Even though I'm a speech and language pathologist, I was working in an inner city school in Cleveland, Ohio, which, those families were not really interested in a second language.
Sure. Sure.
So I had to really learn and study about bilingualism, bilingual language development, bilingual language disorders. And we just put our children right into Japanese preschool, Yochien, and without thinking they would continue on to Japanese elementary school. But our older daughter really wanted to go with her friends to elementary school, and we said, okay, we'll give it a try. And it was kind of an experiment. The whole thing was an experiment.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot and from them. And then with my continued study, I have been able to give a lot of recommendations to families who are wanting to raise their children bilingually, whether they're a Japanese family going to school in English, or another language English speaking family going to school in Japanese, and how parents can support good academics, language learning, and social emotional development.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. And so, how old were your girls when you came back to Japan?
Uh, 1.5, 18 months, and 4. So
Right.
the little one didn't start until she started Yochien at 3, but we put our older one right into Yochien as soon as we came. And then we have a son who's younger, and we followed the same path of going to Japanese Yochien first, going to Japanese elementary school, and then in around 4th or 5th grade, switching to international school.
So, I guess within that sort of context, what are some of the main points? I mean, obviously this is a massive topic as well, but what are some of the main things that I guess first of all, through the research and through your continuing education, that you found pivotal to bilingual language development?
Yeah, it is a big topic, but I'll try and think about the main points that are important for parents to consider. Um, First of all, I think we need to really understand that every family is different, and every family has their own goals and their own needs for language development. But that needs to be clearly understood within the family so that you can plan for bilingualism. Because although you think, oh, it just happens by osmosis, it doesn't. It really needs to be planned and thought out, and you need to be aware of how both languages are developing as your child moves forward, to be sure that they are developing language sufficiently to be able to succeed in school. So let
Sure.
me just say that bilingualism is really on a continuum. At
Sure.
one end, we have balanced bilinguals who are equal in both languages in all areas. Rare, it's actually quite rare.
Mm.
And at the other end, we have semilinguals who really have neither language strong enough to be successful in school.
Right.
So parents have to be very careful about continually monitoring language learning and academics to be sure that their child will be successful in school, especially academically in school.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to say that there are two kinds of language learning. There's what we call BICS, which is basic interpersonal communication skills. This is just social language. This is language when your kids are playing with each other, or for adults, it's like when we go to the store, when we give taxi cab drivers directions. It's just social language we use every day. And that usually for children takes maybe a year or two to learn. But academic language takes much longer. It's much more complex. There's much more vocabulary and abstract language required, and that can take 5 to 7 years. So
Mm.
when parents are considering um, children's language learning, they have to realize that if their first language is not the language of the school, it may take them longer to develop an equal amount of language ability compared to a monolingual child within that school system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have to be prepared to support both languages. Even if you don't speak one of the languages, you need to really understand how the second language is developing, to be sure that your child is getting the information and that they need, especially when they're going to school academically.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So often people think, well, children, there are also two kinds of bilingualism, bilingual language development. Simultaneous, when they're learning two languages simultaneously. Maybe one parent speaks one language and the other parent speaks the other language, or they go to daycare in Japanese and they speak English at home.
Mm.
And those children are learning both languages as if it were their first language,
Right.
generally.
Yeah.
Then there are children who enter a second language, maybe at preschool or later, and they have their first language well established from home. So these children also will learn language similarly to a child learning the first language, but they're going to be a little bit later in their second language development.
Right.
And an important point to think about is that a child needs to be exposed to a language at least 30% of their total language exposure for it to develop normally. So when you're thinking about bilingualism, and if a child is going to school in Japanese all day and comes home and maybe mom is a Japanese speaker and dad is the English speaker, and dad spends maybe an hour speaking to them in English at home, that's probably not enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
It won't be 30% of their day.
Mm. And so, if a child is going to school in one language and then speaking the other language at home, obviously, the further they get in terms of their academic journey, the longer they're going to be spending at home. But say in the preschool years, would that equate to about 50-50 or?
Yes,
Yeah.
if they're speaking one language at school and then the other language at home, that's pretty ideal,
Mm.
especially in the preschool years. When they begin to enter a consideration when they begin to enter elementary school is literacy.
Yeah.
So really, to become a balanced bilingual, you have to be able to read and write in both languages, because you're not going to be able to develop the sophisticated vocabulary and language structures or higher level academic thinking
Sure.
in the other language without being able to read and write.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you just have social language, which again, this is fine. If this is what the family's goal is, there is no problem with that. You know, if you just want to have enough language so that you can play with other kids, speak with grandparents, that certainly is fine. But if your goal is more balanced bilingualism, then you have to be sure that they're learning to read and write in both languages. And that's the responsibility of the parents to provide that in if the language they're not going to school in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if your child's going to school to Japanese school, then you have to provide the reading and writing instruction somehow at home or with a tutor or with a teacher in English.
Yeah.
And if the other thing is, if your goal, again, this is why planning is so important, to have your goals clear, because if your goal is maybe in fifth grade, they're going to go to Japanese school till fifth grade, then maybe they're going to switch to international school. Well, switching to international school in Tokyo is not like going to public school in the United States where everybody gets to go. In international school requires that you have some ability to read and write and speak in the language of the school.
Mm.
So it really is a responsibility to monitor literacy development as well as oral language development when you're thinking about the possibility of switching schools at a later time.
Sure. And is that ideally done concurrently, so at the same time? The
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
yes. Yeah, you can't wait. It's good not to wait. I mean, of course, you can learn a second language. You can learn to read and write in a second language at any time in your lifespan.
Yeah.
People do it all the time. They become bilingual in a second language as an adult.
Mm.
The thing that won't happen, though, is native pronunciation.
Sure.
So really, in order to have native like pronunciation, a child needs to begin learning, needs to really have learned the language by like 5 or 6 years old. Because by the time kids are like 7, 8, they start losing that ability to reproduce language accurately, the sounds accurately. There are some people who are talented in that area. They have a skill and they're able to do it at any time, but most of us are not. And
Mm.
so you never really gain that native like pronunciation if you begin learning the second language past about 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And are there other, yeah, facets of bilingualism that I guess there's sort of windows for growth in those areas at different ages? Are there sort of, or no, it
No,
just
not really. No,
mm,
I don't think there's any windows.
mm,
There,
mm,
once you start, if you continue to receive the input that you're hearing it and you practice the output that you're speaking and using the language, then language learning will continue. And of course, if you stop and you leave that language at a certain time and it hasn't been well established, you may lose it. For example, a child who's gone to preschool in English and maybe in the United States, and then they come back to Japan and they enter Japanese elementary school and they don't really use English again. They will lose that language that they've learned, but they may be able to relearn it at a later date with good pronunciation and more easily than an individual who's never had exposure to it. But it really takes that 5 to 7 years to develop the language well enough to keep it and be able to use it in a school setting.
yeah, yeah. And are there there factors about the Japanese language that make it different from achieving bilingualism in other languages? Or
No, I don't think it really matters. I mean, language is language. Of course, there's a different writing system, there's a different, grammatical system, but research has shown that children can learn, they say, up to 7 languages simultaneously, that it's
mm,
possible. So no, I don't think it matters which languages the child is learning or beginning to use. They will develop normally as if it were one language, as long as there's no underlying language disorder. And of course, bilingualism never causes language disorders, but obviously children have language disorders, and if they're going to have it in one language, they're going to have it in a second language.
Right.
So this is another thing that parents have to be aware of and monitor their child's language development in both languages.
Mm,
If a parent thinks that, they're not developing language as I would expect, but maybe it's due to bilingualism, but it's not due to bilingualism.
right. Right.
If
No, that's interesting.
if parents have that gut feeling that the language just isn't quite right in either language, they should really seek out the advice of an speech and language pathologist to check that, because for any speech and language disorder, early intervention is so successful. And
Mm,
all of the research has shown that the earlier you intervene and that children receive um, some support with their language development, the more quickly they will be able to improve and show progress.
yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And I guess signs that there may be some sort of language disorder. Is it just not being on par with their peers in terms of communication? Are there any specific things that parents should?
Yes, being on par with their peers is a very good thing for parents, because that's easy for parents to observe.
Mm,
My child just doesn't sound like these other kids. They're not using as many words. Their sentences aren't so complex. When they're telling me a story, I really can't follow what they're saying. They can't express what they want to say well, or they may have um, sound errors. They're producing sounds incorrectly. And, of course, two languages might not have all the same sounds, so you have to be aware of both languages and how is their sound production in each of the languages. Um, Also, if parents find that their children are not really understanding what they're hearing, what their parents are saying to them, giving instructions, reading a book and asking them to retell the story. Can they retell you the story? Is it sequential? Are they able to tell you what happened during their school day? Can they recount things that happened to them? All of these things are good indications, if children can do it, that their language is developing normally on par with other kids. I would say I feel parents have a good gut reaction
mm,
to their kids. They know if something doesn't seem quite right, and they shouldn't wait. And I want to say that sometimes a pediatrician or a doctor may just say, oh, it's bilingualism, but it is often not.
right. Right. No, that's a really important point. And just to clarify, a child of two Australian parents speaking with American accent, that's not necessarily a developmental disorder, is it?
Maybe they're going to school. Are they going to school in
No, going to Japanese school, but
speaking
probably
with?
watching a little bit too much American TV.
Oh, I don't. That's funny. Yeah. If they go back to Australia, they'll gain their accent back.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure.
I hope it's not a problem for you.
No, it's not a problem. The grandparents are starting to get a little bit concerned, but yeah, they've got very much international accents, as we call them.
Good. It's good.
You mentioned earlier that you had your children sort of switch over from the Japanese elementary system into the international school system around fourth or fifth grade, and I've heard you know similar sort of approaches from other parents. And like I said, with our children, we've got one who's going into third year of Yochien in April next month, and the younger one is actually starting Yochien next month, and we're trying to educate ourselves on what's the best way forward, and how to bring them up in as much of a bilingual environment as possible. And obviously, like you said, it depends on the goals of the family. But is that sort of a time, if someone was going to make that switch, is that sort of the optimal time in sort of mid to late elementary school, or what's?
So I'll explain to you our reasoning for
Sure.
doing that. So of course I've worked in the international school, so I know what's happening in international school. I know what the expectations are. And generally from grades 1 to 3, kids are learning to read, they're learning to write, they're learning math. Then from grade 4, they're reading to learn.
Mm.
Things change. They're able to read, they're able to write, they do math, and they are taking that skill and using it to gain information, to research, to determine fact from fiction. Is this true? Is this true? Is this not? They're doing more abstract learning. And I feel that that is a very different way of learning than in the Japanese school. So that I wanted to say a little bit about that.
Mm.
That when you're thinking about schooling, that you have to think about you're thinking about language development, because that's of course a main goal of going to a school in a different language, that you want language. It's a wonderful cultural experience. You become part of a community in your area, in your neighborhood. Um, but you have to think about philosophy of education. Do you agree with the philosophy of education in the Japanese system as compared with the Western schools, which is quite different?
Yeah.
Japanese schools are very teacher directed. Everybody does the same thing at the same time, the same way. Individuality is not necessarily encouraged, and you follow the path of the class wherever you are. You may be in the middle, the top, the bottom, but everybody's going to do the same story at the same time, the same way.
Yeah.
So this may not suit all children. And when they have to switch into a system where you're expected to be an independent learner, and you're expected to ask the questions, decide how you're going to proceed in your learning, it can be a very difficult transition. And the longer you wait to do this, the more difficult for the child it may be.
Yeah.
All children are different. You have to look at your own child and determine
Yeah.
when is the best time to make this move. Even I found that for many kids in Japanese school, moving to international school, math can be more difficult because math is taught in such a different way. It's very language based in international schools, and it's very number based
Yeah.
in Japanese school. So there are really many, many things that parents need to consider when they're sending their children to school in a language that's different than their own.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I really like that. So learning to read and then transitioning to reading to learn. I think it parallels what we in athletics have this long-term athletic development, which sort of goes through similar stages, like the learning to train and training to train, training to compete, training to win. We sort of go through that progression, and it's sort of seemed to be the most effective way to foster athletic development. So I think it's interesting to see that there's a similar sort of approach in learning. What there are any other sort of main points that that you think people should consider?
So if I want to just reiterate that 30% of the day needs to be in the language that is not probably the school language, because the school language, you're going to get a lot of it all during the day. So
Mm,
parents need to think about how they're going to provide that time in the language. And that language needs to be rich. It can't just be the same every day. They come home from school and you say, what did you do at school? What do you want for dinner? Time to take a bath, time to go to bed. I mean, it can't be just that. It has to
sure,
be rich language where you're discussing information, and that you may be reading to your young child books about many different topics.
mm,
And then when they are a little bit older, you really have to be sure that they're learning to read and write in
yeah,
the language. And you may have to provide that if you're unable to do it, you need to find a tutor to do it, or somehow so that they can begin the literacy process. The the other thing that is important that I didn't mention is becoming bicultural.
yes, yeah,
So it's not just language, it's how you respond in the culture.
mm,
So parents have to be sure that their children are receiving opportunities to use the language, both languages, in many different experiences and with many different people, so
sure,
that they understand how to use language appropriately in a situation that may not be their home.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's becoming bicultural and bilingual so that you appear appropriate and natural in both languages.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And I have, in the time that I've been here, come across quite a number of bilingual. I think it tends to be, yes, a bilingual, half Japanese and half foreign, uh, that can speak perfect English, but culturally they're very, very Japanese. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just an interesting sort of presentation when you meet someone like that.
It's always good to be able to move between cultures. I really feel that for foreigners, going to Japanese school provides that,
Mm,
because a major goal of Japanese school is to make Japanese citizens.
right.
So you're going to become somewhat Japanese.
Yeah.
But again, this can be a problem, because if you're 100% foreigner, as we are, our children are, our grandchildren are,
Yeah.
you have to be careful about acceptance within the group,
Yes.
acceptance within the school, acceptance when in the group. Is your child being treated equally? They're not being excluded from the group, they're included. And I do find that sometimes expectations are not the same for a foreign child as they are for a Japanese child. There are many considerations when sending your child to a school where it's not your native language or your culture.
Mm, mm, yeah. Okay. That's fantastic information there, and I'm sure you can elaborate on all those points in an amazing amount of detail. If people are looking at raising bilingual children and were looking for some advice, how might they get in contact with you?
I can give an email. Can I just give the email right now? Or
Sure, and
I can
yeah,
provide it?
yeah, and we will put it in the show notes. But if you want to provide it here, that would be fine as
It's
well.
very easy. It's Marsha SLP at
Okay.
gmail.com.
Okay.
Speech language pathologist, Marsha SLP at
Okay.
gmail.com. Yeah, please, people are welcome to email me, and then I will, can provide a consultation session. I do offer consultation sessions for parents who are just looking at making a plan
Yeah.
for their child's further bilingual education.
Yeah, yeah, okay. And your speech and language pathology group here in Tokyo, do you have a website? Do you have social media at
We
all, or is it
don't,
just
and people can write to me about that too.
okay?
If anyone is interested in has speech and language needs, please don't hesitate to write to me, and I will explain the process for receiving assessment and placement with a speech and language pathologist within our group.
Okay, terrific. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Marsha. It's good to catch up again, and we really appreciate your time. And we might get you back in the future to talk about some other topics related to speech and language pathology.
My pleasure.
All
Thank
right. Thanks, Marsha. Have a great day.
thank you. Bye.